chair is typically the chief volunteer officer, responsible for leading the board, extremely passionate about the organization, very approachable, a good listener, and knowledgeable about organization and board practices. So again, it's kind of your top volunteer for the organization, because if you think about the organization is two-sided, the executive director is in charge of the staff, and the board chair is in charge of the board. And the board chair and the executive director work together to have a successful meeting and a successful organization. So the next is actually what's the job of the board chair. And I'm not going to read every slide. So if I skip a slide or go, you'll have a copy of the PowerPoint at some point. But I want to remind you that typically the board chair leads the board and facilitates board meetings. If the board chair is not available for a meeting, then the vice chair would facilitate. If the vice chair is not available, it would be the secretary or treasurer. But at some point you need to think about, if your top leadership can't be at the board meeting, do you need to have that board meeting? It should never be the executive director or somebody that just steps in to run the board meeting, because the board chair is the person that can look around the room and say, oh, Amy's on her cell phone, not paying any attention, or whatever, and try and keep everybody engaged in the meeting and make sure everybody's participating. The other thing about the board chair is that a lot of boards have committees, and so the board chair would work with the executive director to kind of appoint committee chairs and make sure that the committee chairs all understand their role and how each committee works interchangeably. Again, the board chair leads the meetings. So the agenda is made by the board chair and the executive director, and that's very important. They need to work together to do that. Also, the board chair needs to be the bad guy, kind of, to make sure if somebody's hogging up the meeting or whatever, that they need to kind of help control the flow of the meeting. And board chair should not be talking the whole meeting. They should be facilitating, which means allowing the staff and the board members to talk appropriately and add in their 2 cents. So I know that somebody's going to have this question, so I anticipated it. So yes, the chair can vote on the, just like any other board member. Some chairs vote while others abstain and vote only when they need to break a tie. So that's kind of an organization by organization thing, but the board chair does have the right to vote. So let me talk again. You're going to hear a lot today about the characteristics of effective board staff partnerships, because again, the staff works really closely with the board. The staff, as you probably are aware, puts through the policies and the programs, and they do the day-to-day. The board comes in and makes the policies and also does high-level governance. So, but they have to work together to make an effective organization happen. So this is just 4 things that we'll talk more about, but I just want to kind of set the stage. These are things that that are pretty critical to a successful organization, and the board and staff work together on it. So typically, the board would actually write the mission and vision, but you want to make sure the staff has a buy-in in it, and that they both understand the impact that the programs and the work the organization is doing, how it affects the mission and the vision. Also, there should be a clear role and responsibility. So board members need to be held accountable. They need to know what's expected of them. Staff needs to know their role. There also should be open and honest communication, and also 2-way evaluation. So it's important that the staff, gets to weigh in on evaluating different things. They might once a year get asked, a private evaluation of how they think the executive director is leading the organization. And then the board would also do that. And the board, it's important to note that the board only reviews the executive director, or CEO. The staff is reviewed by the executive director/CEO. If a board member has a problem with the staff member, they should take it to the executive director and not confront that staff directly in a negative way. It's very important to kind of understand the kind of lines of authority and communication. Let me just check. I saw some stuff in the chat. Stephanie, are we okay with the chat? Do I need to stop and do any questions? Or I can't get to my chat.
Oh, I've got a question.
Okay.
Should you or can you make attendance mandatory during pandemic? What is an effective or acceptable attendance policy for board members during the pandemic?
So typically, when you write your bylaws originally, there are usually a note in there, something about possible attendance, usually under the board expectation sheet, which is not a legal document, but a lot of organizations are putting together a board expectation sheet. There's usually, something about attendance. I mean, I've seen in bylaws where some boards say, if you don't attend, if you miss more than X number of meetings, you're out. I think you have to weigh that and really make a decision how effective you're going to be. You may need to set some new policies during COVID or during virtual meetings. It's a good time to kind of look at your bylaws and make sure they're up to date. There's no right or wrong, no way to enforce other than to hold board members accountable. One of the things that a lot of organizations do is, so the committee chair is responsible for contacting committee members. So don't wait till the third meeting somebody hasn't attended of a committee meeting. Actually, as a board chair, somebody should contact that person after the second meeting they've missed and leave a voicemail or get in touch with them and say, hey, so-and-so, saw you missed a couple committee meetings. Can we talk about getting you up to date? Same thing with the board meetings. The board chair, if it's noticed that someone's missing a lot of meetings, the board chair should get on the phone and call that person and just, if you can't reach them, to say, hey, Amy, I see you've missed a couple board meetings. Can we talk? And let's get you brought back up to speed. And, like I said, attendance policies are attendance policies. You have to just be careful of how much you're going to enforce them and not, because you don't want to be kicking people off every 5 minutes. You want to be impactful about really, if somebody can't come to a meeting, are they still doing other things for the organization? Does that answer the question?
Amy, the participant has a follow-up question, and I'm going to have him ask it personally because I'm not sure. He may have to, Antoine, I'm going to open your mic if you'll ask that question.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I was just asking for the board composition, would you advise even having a vice chair to help with some of the different things?
Yes. Typically, you would have different officers. Usually you want to have a chair and a vice chair and maybe a secretary treasurer combo or one of each. It depends on, I was secretary of an organization once, but I didn't actually physically take the minutes. Somebody on the staff took the minutes, and my job as the secretary was just to sign the minutes once they were completed and possibly review them. So you just need to determine, based on the size of your board, how many officers you really need, and they'll make up the executive committee, as you'll hear later. So let me keep going. And again, I'm not going to read every slide, but I want to just go back over this mission and vision, because I think it's really important, is that remember that as the board is responsible for making sure the organization is always operating on mission. So if I'm the executive director and I come to the board and we're the board of a nursing home and I come to you with some crazy idea that we need to add childcare to the nursing home, then you as the board need to determine what the real reason for that is. And if you're going to vote on it and agree that we're going to go that way, help the new program happen and make sure it is impactful to the mission. So these, in the red box over here, you'll see some things that the board and staff can do together. And you'll see it's sort of what I just said, is ensure the mission is integrated into marketing, fundraising, meetings, and decision-making. Make sure that the board has passion for mission. And one of the things you'll hear later about is making sure that you're doing something like a mission moment or something. So the board is not, when they come to board meetings, they're not just hearing statistics, that they're hearing stories and anecdotal stuff about clients and how clients are being impacted by the mission, and also making sure that you're measuring performance related to mission and communicating purpose based on mission. So mission is really critical. It's the reason that an organization exists. It affects everything that the organization does. So I want to talk now about what should the board expect from the chief executive. And the reason that I'm talking about this is because typically, if you think about from a reporting standpoint, the board chair oversees directly the executive director or CEO. So like from a reporting standpoint, if you think about like a corporate structure, the whole board is the CEO, executive director's boss, but they most closely communicate with the board chair. Board chair can get input from the rest of the board, but they're the person that they talk to the most while that person is board chair. So again, the role of the chief executive or the CEO is to make sure that they're positive about how they're working, that he or she is identifying items for board attention. So I was a board chair of an organization, and the first thing that we did is I sat down with the executive director in like July when I started my term, and we actually identified things that we wanted to work on for the year. Like, so for example, we actually wanted to make sure there was a succession plan for board members, officers, and for the executive director. We also wanted to make sure that we updated the bylaws because it hadn't been updated in a couple of years. We wanted to make sure that we updated committee descriptions. And so it was fine. The board, the executive director and myself as the board chair, we decided those things together, and then we kind of laid out responsibilities of which committee might be responsible for that, what staff might be responsible for that, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important that the executive director understand that they can have a role in shaping the organization. Just because they report to the board doesn't mean that they don't have, you know, any say in anything. They also, typically the executive director CEO makes up the agenda and they check with the board chair. It's not up to the board chair to write the agenda. It's typically driven by the executive director / CEO, and it's typically a set agenda every time there's a meeting, like, you know, new business, old business, minutes, that kind of stuff. And so again, the board chair the executive director is the most accountable person in the organization. So again, thinking about what he or she, the executive director, should expect from the board is that they want the board to do high-level governing, not day-to-day operations. You don't want your board in the weeds. There should be mutual accountability. So update job descriptions, performance objectives. Again, directors who come to the board meeting prepare. They're not first opening their email or their hard copy notes for the board as they walk in or as they get on the Zoom, because it's, again, very important. People come prepared and ready to participate actively. And then the last bullet here is pretty important. It's that a board speaks with one voice. So typically, every board should be on the same page. It doesn't mean that every board meeting you're going to have a kumbaya and agree on everything. You want to have active discussions at the board meeting, but once the board makes a vote on something, you agree as a board member to go out in the community and, you know, be the voice for that program or that idea. Even if you didn't agree with it, you don't go out in the community and say, well, I didn't agree with this. You know, you kind of go with the way the board comes to consensus. And that's part of the job of the board chair, is when he or she runs the meetings and to help get the board to consensus. The other thing about one voice is that typically you only want to have one spokesperson for the organization. So whether that's the board chair or the executive director, that should be decided. And then if you as a board member, somebody as a board member gets stopped by the press or called by the press for something, you want to say, yes, I am a board member. We're aware of this situation, and we're going to get you to the executive director or board chair who can give you the full story. And you as a board member should have talking points. That's part of the job of the chief executive to provide you with talking points. But again, everybody on the board should not be talking to the press. It should be one person, and everybody should be telling the same story. So I want to also continue to talk about this. So again, the board chair supports the chief executive. So again, the chief executive or board or the executive director, they have active and regular communication with the board chair. They also liaison between the board and the chief executive. So if the board is unhappy with something about the executive director or a staff member, they would go to the board chair, and the board chair will communicate it to the executive director or chief executive. Also, the board chair should not evaluate the executive director in a vacuum. He or she needs to have some kind of formal evaluation set up and make sure they're getting feedback from all the board members, you know, and appropriate staff where done. And then the board chair is the person that typically talks to the chief executive and says, hey, you know, the board is concerned because we need more help at the front desk, or we need more, you know, help when we do a program, or we need more safety here. So that's the job of the board chairs, to be directly liaison. When I was the board chair of the same organization I was talking about before, the executive director and I set up a regular meeting schedule, whether it was once a month, once every 2 weeks. So those are really important kind of check-ins, and you know, you may end up easing those, you know, like let's say when you start your role as board chair, you want to meet once a month, and then you realize, well, maybe we only need to meet once every 6 weeks. So it's a flexible thing, but it needs to happen. And I'm not going to go through this slide, but these are 5 questions that every CEO and board chair should address together. And I think, you know, I kind of covered those, but these are some really kind of lays it out. You know, what do you expect of each other? You know, where do we draw the line? One of the other questions that usually comes up with the board chair and CEO relationships, who's going to speak out to the public? Like if there's a program and somebody has to speak. Typically, I would say it's the executive director or chief executive, because they're the face of the organization. It's not, the board chair typically has a, you know, 1 to 2 to 3 year term limit. So typically you want to promote that the CEO, executive director is the face. Now, of course, if the CEO can't be there, or the board chair is there without the CEO for whatever reason, you know, the board chair should know the routine and be able to speak. So important that communication is decided up front. And again, here's kind of a little kind of summary of what I've been talking about: roles of the board chair on the left and roles of the chief executive on the right. And again, I think you can kind of see, you know, the board chair has a more high level role, supporting the board in policy and oversight, facilitating the board meetings, making sure that, you know, that people on the board are happy with what committees they're on and they're all engaged. On the chief executive side, it's making sure that they have the right staff in place, making sure that they're working to make an operational plan based on the strategic plan. Remember that typically a strategic plan is done in coordination with the board and the staff. Doesn't mean all staff participate, but whatever the appropriate staff and the executive or chief executive would participate with the board, either the whole board or the whole board and part of the board as a committee. But again, the operational plans typically come from the strategic plan. Also, the chief executive also typically represents the organization, supports board governance function, and collaborates with the chair on board meeting prep. And you'll keep hearing this theme over and over again. Again, remember that the board is responsible for high-level governance. The staff and the executive director is responsible for the day-to-day. So it's really important to remember that, you know, like as board members, we all bring a certain expertise to the table, but it doesn't mean that we, you know, like for example, when I serve on a board, I bring governance expertise and some fundraising expertise. Does not mean that I walk into the organization and say, here's a fund development plan, go to it. I mean, they can call on me for my fundraising expertise, but typically I keep my mouth shut until they ask me for advice. And so you don't want to overstep your role as a board member, because you obviously would have competent people in place, starting with the chief executive, and then he or she would make sure you've got competent staff working for the organization that reports back to them. So again, the board and the staff work totally together to have a successful organization. You really need both. And again, you see where the board takes the lead, the board and the CEO share, and the CEO leads. And I'll just hit a couple of the highlights. Again, the board is in charge of hiring, supporting, and evaluating the CEO. The board is got the financial due diligence, and also the board works to recruit and retain new board members. And I'm going to skip for a minute to go over here to the board CEO. And again, a lot of people wonder, as executive directors, they say, well, my board doesn't want me involved in recruiting and retaining board members. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because remember that board members work on committees and work, volunteer in the organization sometimes. So the board, the executive director or CEO and staff have access to those board members. The executive director and staff also are out in the community. So the executive director should work closely with the board to help identify new board members and keep people engaged. It's not the board over here and the staff over here. It's working together on certain things. Also, again, the board and the CEO share leadership on strategic plan, fundraising plan. I will say that not necessarily the board doesn't write the fundraising plan. Typically, staff and the development committee would write the fundraising plan, and typically the fundraising plan would align with the budget of the organization, but there should be places in the fundraising plan where the board helps identify donors, cultivate donors, steward donors, helps make introduction to donors, helps do fundraising for the organization. So that's where that fundraising plan and strategies are. And also the board needs to be prepared for board meetings, even though the board chair and the executive director put together the agenda. It's perfectly appropriate for a board member to call the board chair and say, hey, can we talk about X, Y, and Z at the next board meeting? And then the CEO is in the middle, and you can see that the CEO has a pretty active role. They may go to the board chair and say, these are issues that we need to talk about either in committee or executive committee or with the whole board. These are policies that I think we might need the board to look at approving. The executive director or chief executive hires the staff. It's not appropriate for me as a board member to go to the chief executive and say, oh, my daughter is just graduating college and wants a job as a development person. That's not appropriate for me to push any of that. I might say my daughter's put in her resume, I don't want you to give her any special treatment. That's more appropriate. But again, the executive director, chief executive is the person that supports, hires, and motivates the staff. Are we okay question-wise, Stephanie? Because I can't see the chat box.
Yes, so we've got 3 questions.
Okay.
One of them I think you did answer though, but I just want to make sure. Someone asked, what is a mission moment?
So a mission moment is typically like a golden nugget. So at every board meeting, you want to put on the agenda time for a mission moment. And that can be something that a board member shares, a staff member shares, the executive director shares. It could bring in an outside source. It's something to educate the board about the impact the organization is making. So for example, you might tell a client story. You might say, here's what's happening in our sector. Like, let's say you're in the affordable housing sector. Here's something that's going to affect our work. So as a board member, when you leave the board meeting, not only have you heard the budget, you only gotten an update on programs, but you've gotten a special thing, so that kind of a special information, so that when you go out in the community as a board member, you're even more educated about the organization and can better tell the story.
Okay, we've got, should the ED or the current president serve on the organization's governance committee?
Yes, both. We're going to talk about governance committee, but yes, it doesn't necessarily need to be chaired by the board chair, but the governance committee, you should have the executive director or chief executive as the staff person on that. And then typically the board chair would sit on that meeting.
And last question. This was a few minutes ago. I said, is that different when it's a working board? Not
okay,
sure.
So I can address that. So I will tell you that I personally don't like the word working board, because every board is a working board, whether you are a mature organization and been around for 20 years and have a board of 32 people and a staff of 50 people, or if you're a board brand new and you have, one staff person and 3 people on your board. Every board is a working board. It just depends on, typically the startup organizations, the board is going to be more grassroots and more hands-on. You know, like when you're starting your organization, you may have no staff. And so the board would have to have a dual role as volunteers making the programs happen, and also volunteer treasurer, a volunteer CEO or whatever. Even a mature board, when you say a working board, people serve on committees, and that's considered working for the organization. So I personally don't like the word working board, but I'm going to make a note. Stephanie, I have a handout on working board, and I will send you the handouts to kind of, when we're done, extra handouts that you can send out to people.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to keep going. This, I'm not going to read this quote, but it just talks about the balance of the board chair and the CEO relationship. And again, they're just, the board chair is probably the most important, one of the most important relationships and people that you would have on your board. So again, as you continue to cultivate this board chair CEO relationship, you want to think, these are just 5 things that, you want to think about, that don't, they're both juggling different roles and responsibilities. And so they need to understand what each brings to the table. And if you have a board chair who's not comfortable doing something, either let's get them training to get them comfortable, or let's count on the vice chair or the secretary or treasurer to kind of step in and help in that role. And both the board chair and the CEO want to build relationships with the individual board members, because that's called cultivation, and it's called keeping the board members engaged and involved. You don't just want to, say, oh, the board chair is going to work with all the board members and I'm going to work with the staff. You want to, both of you kind of want to work with both sides of it. So again, the board chair and the CEO's relationship is really about trust, and about making sure that everybody's kind of keeping each other accountable. The board chair really keeps the board accountable. So again, if people are not attending meetings, whether they're virtual or in person, why is somebody not attending? Is the meeting scheduled at a time when they're not available, or are they just not engaged enough to come to the meetings, and what's really going on? And so the board and the staff work together to make sure that everybody in the organization is engaged. Because if you have a disengaged board, staff is going to get disheartened because they feel like they don't have support behind them to, do their work and make the impact they're doing. So because this is virtual, I just want everybody to think about, and we don't have to share unless, I just looking at the time, we probably have time for a couple people to speak up, but what word, or if you want to put it in the chat, what word or phrase best describes your current relationship between you and your CEO ED, if you're a board member, or if you're a board chair? So like Stephanie, I'll put you on the spot for a minute. What's the word or phrase that best describes your relationship with your board chair?
Ever growing.
Okay.
I love it because it's a consistent building of a relationship and kind of learning from each other.
Good. Anybody else want to share? You want to put it in the chat and Stephanie can share it?
Let's see. I don't see any chats yet. I have some questions in here if you want.
Okay, sure.
What is your opinion on board members being or not being family friends of the executive director, CEO? For instance, if I am creating the nonprofit and looking for a board, do I consider that?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things to remember is that when you serve as a board member, you have to, an individual board member, one of your responsibilities is to not have any conflicts of interest, or to disclose those conflicts of interest and make sure that when voting on issues or issues come up, you're removing yourself from that situation. So for example, if you're a startup organization, because this is typically when you see it the most, the startup organizations or the fairly new organizations typically would have a few friends of friends you know, on the board of each other, because that's how you get people engaged and involved. But if Stephanie is the executive director or chief executive, and I'm her neighbor and her best friend, and Alexandra is also on the board and she's her other best friend, when we're voting on stuff that affects Stephanie's salary or Stephanie's evaluation or different things, we need to disclose that we have a conflict and we need to not vote on that. So that's the best way to handle it. I mean, it's best practice typically eventually not to have so many friends on the board, you know, as far as people that have those kind of conflicts, but it's going to happen until you get your kind of routine up and get more people engaged and involved in the organization. Does that answer the question?
So we have some responses. Let's see. Kimberly Mack Hammond said building. Courtney Boone said amazing.
And this is the relationship between the board chair and the CEO
Yes.
of ED. Yeah.
Yes. Lisa Coleman said mutual respect. She said, sorry for 2 words. The King's Daughters relationship between their executive director and board president.
Good. You guys can think about that as you continue to go through as we continue to go through the PowerPoint. But I think it's just really important. If you have a combative relationship, you need to think about how to make it better or what you can do. I'll give you one story. One of my consulting clients, when she first came on the organization as executive director, they had a board chair who didn't really understand her role as the board chair, and she was out for herself. So she would do things like hold an executive committee meeting and not invite the board chair. Or this board chair actually called a funder and almost screwed up a grant because she wanted to, you know, typically the board chair would not call a funder without the executive director knowing. It's usually the executive director works directly with the funder unless, you know, there's like a personal relationship between the board chair and the funder, and they're just calling to put in a good word or something. But this board chair took it upon herself to actually call the funder and try and, you know, get involved in the grant making. The other thing this board chair did is the organization got a large grant, and they had planned a press conference with the group that gave them the grant. They were going to do a press conference, and so the board knew about the press conference, and the day before the press conference, the board chair realized that she couldn't be at the press conference. So she called the executive director and asked her to change the press conference because she couldn't be there. So bottom line of the story is that this board chair was just totally out of line. I tried to work with her to kind of help her better understand her role, et cetera, et cetera. It just wasn't working. So we had to go to the vice chair, and luckily the vice chair was willing to step up early and step in as the board chair instead of waiting another, 6 months to a year when her term would be effective. And she convinced diplomatically the board chair to step down, and the organization's just humming along, doing great now. But it could have been a lot of issues if the vice chair hadn't stepped in and kind of diplomatically convince the board chair to resign. So again, you need to have a good relationship. And if you don't have a good relationship with your board chair, figure out who in the organization you do have a good relationship with, and let's try and negotiate that or bring in an outside person to help work on the relationship. So, and one of the other things I will say is, typically one of the ways to avoid this bad relationship is just to make sure that just because I'm the largest donor or I have the biggest voice doesn't mean that I'm the best person to be the board chair. So you need to be strategic as you do your board succession and thinking about who's going to be the next board chair and the board chair after that. So again, more just that it's a constructive partnership of chief executive and board chair working together, and a lot of respect and trust and honesty. So, what is it? I can't see what this is. This must just be an empty slide. Okay, so I want to talk now just a couple things. Let me just mention, there seems to be confusion sometimes in an organization as to what's the job of the executive committee. And I think it's important when you think about board chair roles and meetings and things like that to kind of bring that up. So typically the executive committee is made up of officers. You can have like an at-large person, or sometimes it's officers and committee chairs. But again, the purpose of the executive committee is not to make decisions for the board. They could make decisions in the absence of a board if it's an emergency, but you shouldn't like railroad over the board and have the executive committee make decisions and then come back to the board to rubber stamp it. That's not great. Because again, there's a bullet in here that says the executive committee promptly reports to and is accountable to the full board. So again, typically if you go back and review your bylaws, there is usually information in the bylaws about the executive committee. And again, your bylaws should be reviewed every couple of years. Doesn't mean they have to be changed, but to be updated because your organization may have started one way and be operating, a little bit different. And again, this thing about a shadow board, it just means that the board should not be a rubber stamp for what the executive committee approves. In an emergency situation, the executive committee can make budget decisions and different things, but typically most decisions should go to the full board. And again, here's just some pitfalls to kind of, if you avoid these pitfalls, then you shouldn't have a quote unquote too powerful a board member, executive committee. So the executive committee should not amend bylaws. It should be amended by the full board. The executive committee's job is not to elect or remove board members. In your bylaws, there should be a clause about how you can remove a board member, but you typically have to do it through the whole board and not just board members. Also, it's not the job of the executive committee to hire or fire chief executive. That's the full board's job. Also, executive committee shouldn't approve or change the budget. Again, full board's job. And then this last one is kind of a new thing, but it's very important to understand that, there's a lot of organizations that unfortunately, because of the pandemic, are not able to sustain themselves. Maybe they're merging or whatever, but that's a full board decision and not just an executive committee decision. Because remember, the full board financially has responsibility and fiduciary responsibility for the organization. So you don't want it to be just dissolved by the executive committee. You need a vote of the full board. So now I'm going to talk about board engagement and running effective meetings, because one of the things to remember, again, it's the board chair's job to run the meetings. He or she works closely with the executive director or chief executive to make the agenda. But again, you can't have a engaged board if you don't have effective meetings. But before I start this section, Stephanie, do you have any other questions from people on the first part of the PowerPoint?
I'm looking and I don't see anything new right now.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop for 2 minutes, and just, does anybody have any additional questions before I go on to this section?
If you have a question, I think you can raise your hand on the, or just put something in the chat box and I can unmute you.
Yeah, I can't see everybody on the participant list. I just have a short, but I'll wait a minute.
Do you have any horror stories on actions that executive committees have taken that they really should not have?
Let me think. Nothing that comes to mind. Exactly. Nothing really comes to mind at this point, but I'm sure I'll come up with something. Give me a few minutes to do. I know that I do have a horror story. I'll tell you that when I was teaching a grant class once, this girl came up to me in the class, and I'm not going to tell you what organization she works for, but she said, I just want to ask you a question. She said, when my executive director has board meetings, they usually hold them like in the morning, once a month from like 9 to 11 or whatever, we are told as staff people that we can't come in the building until the board meeting is over. So typically we're allowed to come in after 12, but she will send a big email if the board meeting is going to run over. So she doesn't want us in the building when the board is meeting.
That, I would laugh at how awful that is, but I was a part of an organization where whenever there was a board meeting, all of the staff were to sit in the room outside of it. We were there to welcome them, and then the doors would close and we would wait.
Yeah, typically
we would be called in once in a while.
Yeah, typically what should normally happen is the leadership of like key staff people, depending on how big the organization is, and I'm not defining that term. That's up to each organization to define that. They would be in the board meeting. The only time you would have either just the executive director or no staff would be during an executive session. And I will talk about that in a minute, but it's not typically, board and staff, again, have to work really closely together, and it's not good practice to keep your staff over here and your board over here and ne'er the twain shall meet, because again, that causes the board members to think something's wrong or that they need to step in and micromanage, and it just causes a lot of different problems. So there you go. All right, so I'm going to start on the next section, which is board engagement and running effective meetings. And again, there's a great handout that I sent everybody on, or that I sent Stephanie, and she'll send it out, on best board meetings. Has a lot of best practices in it. There's also a white paper on what is a consent agenda, which I'll talk about. And also there's some information on executive session. Remember that we talked about executive committee, which is typically a committee of the board, which is typically your leadership of the organization. It might be just officers. It could be officers and committee chairs. When I was the board chair of that organization, I keep talking about our executive committee was the officers and the committee chairs, and we would meet. So the way the organization was set up, the board would meet 6 times as a board, and the executive committee would meet 6 times. So we'd have like January would be the board meeting, February would be the executive committee meeting, March would be the board meeting, April would be the executive committee meeting. And the executive committee was a time when each committee chair could share with everybody what they're doing in their committees, how some of the committees overlap. It may be a time for the CEO, executive director, to kind of talk to the board and say, hey, I think, our development person is not working out. Let's talk about how we want to go to the board and tell them what we need, that kind of stuff. So it's more of a planning group and not a time for the executive committee to make decisions. I'll give you one example, I guess. When I was, the organization I keep talking about is called Leadership Metro Richmond. It's an organization where they have a class of 40 to 70 people that go through every year. They're called the Quest, and they learn about the community, Richmond community, and different ways to be a servant leader. And then our board is made up of 30 people who have been gone through the Quest program. And so it's, you have to have gone through the Quest to be on the board. And we used to have 30 members. I'm not sure they still do. And I was the board chair for a year. And so one of the things that came up under my term is that we had to determine the cost of the program, because the cost that we were charging was not effective enough to be able to support the organization, because we didn't have a lot. We really counted on those classes of the costs. It was like a $3,000 cost at the time, I think. So we needed to go to the full board to raise the talk about the cost of the meeting or program. I'm sorry. So the way that the meetings were scheduled, again, I told you it was 1 month board meeting, 1 month executive committee meeting. The decision to raise the cost of the program would have come to the executive committee and not to the full board. So what we did is, instead of having an executive committee meeting, we had a board meeting that month in lieu of so we had an extra board meeting. And before the board meeting, we did a lot of research through committees of what other programs were charging, what our budget could sustain, how many people, all that. And then when we brought it to the full board, we told the board in advance that we were going to bring this topic to the board. We tried to gauge how many people were coming to make sure we had a good attendance. Once the board decided what they were going to do based on facts that we had, gathered for them, if you weren't at the board meeting, we made sure that you got a phone call from either me as the board chair or the executive director telling you what was discussed, what the decision was. And also we gave every board member talking points, because Leadership Metro Richmond has probably about 2,000 members. And so we wanted to make sure that, that people weren't going to get berated by calls saying, hey, I can't believe you raised the dues. I didn't pay that when I went through, and nobody in my company is going to want to go through. It's too expensive. So anyway, that's not a horror story. We kind of planned for it in advance, but those are the kind of things that executive committee and the board chair and the CEO or chief executive work together to make sure the full board is engaged in the right way with the decisions that are being made. So I'm going to keep going, and now I'm going to start talking about board engagement and running effective meetings. So, okay, so these are some of the topics that I'm going to cover. So I'm going to talk about meeting planning, purpose of the meeting, how often, time, location. I'm going to talk about the agenda. Again, that mission moment. We talked a little bit about who drafts the agenda. I'm going to talk about communication between meetings and about running the meeting and board minutes. So if I left anything out at the end, we'll have time to add in. It's not working. Okay, so as far as best practices are concerned for meetings, again, you want to plan in advance. You don't just want to run a meeting by the seat of your pants. You want to have an agenda. Typically, most organizations are using the same kind of skeleton of an agenda every month. They might add or delete things on that agenda, but it's typically, based on, opening of the meeting, approving the minutes, treasurer's report, board chair's report, executive director's report, committee reports, just new business, old business. And you have to be really careful. And I think I put in a sample agenda in here, but you want to be careful that you make the board meeting engaging, so that if it's just a bunch of reports, why do I need to come? I can read those in the minutes or read those in advance when they're sent to me. So you really want to have some engaging time on the agenda to talk about, hey, maybe, we want to talk about how the children's art classes are going and get people's ideas, or maybe we want to spend time talking about our upcoming fundraiser and how we can get more people there. But you want to have some time for interactive discussion at the meeting. So typically, again, you want to make sure that materials are sent in advance, or if you're using a board site, it's posted to the board site. I would make sure also that if you're doing the meeting virtual, that you can share most of the stuff, like screen share when the meetings come up. You also might want to use a consent agenda, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Also might want to use some visuals like dashboards, and at some point you want to think about bringing in experts and guests and other people to, when you have more topics to be covered. Like if, I'm just using an example, let's say you're an affordable housing organization and there's been some, obviously the eviction can now happen because the eviction stoppage or hold on evictions ran out the other day. So maybe you want to bring in somebody or give out some information about how these evictions are affecting your organization and how you do business, and maybe there's resources out there. So when you have the board meeting, you want to think about, how can we keep our board members engaged? We don't just want to talk at them. We want to, get their opinions and their advice. Remember that when you go back to that recruiting your board members, you want to put people on your board who have expertise. Maybe if you're in, again, affordable housing, maybe you have people on your board who, live in affordable housing or work in other organizations that do affordable housing. So everybody you want to make sure everybody's bringing something to the table. You want to also make sure, and this is the board chair's role again, is that everybody's voice is heard. Again, the board chair's job is to make sure you don't have one person overtaking the meeting. You might want to use an executive session, and I'll talk about that also in a minute. Board source kind of says that you should have an executive session at every board meeting. That's up to the organizations, and we'll talk about that. But and you also should periodically evaluate your meetings to say, hey, you know what, we've had terrible attendance. We can't even get a quorum, or we have to wait 30 minutes for enough people to join to have a quorum. So thinking about those things and trying to making decisions on that is important. So when I was, again, the board chair of Leadership Metro Richmond, it was the board chair's choice to decide what time the meeting was. So either it was going to be 7:30, 8 o'clock, or noon, or, you know, late in the afternoon. And so what was happening is when we called a 7:30, 8 o'clock meeting, the executive director was getting tons of emails and texts and phone calls 10 minutes before the meeting saying, hey, I'm going to be late, I'm going to call in, blah, blah, blah. At 12 o'clock, when you have a meeting, you have to think about feeding people, and that can be expensive. So you have to think about, you know, these are for in-person meetings, obviously. I'm not talking virtual, but we could be talking virtual because 12 noon, if people might be the only time, you know, people have in their day to go have lunch, and they can't come to your board meeting. So, you know, virtually even. So thinking about those things, or 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock, you know, when are you going to get the most people there? Do you need to rotate times? That kind of stuff. So notice things like, you know, when are you getting a quorum? Are people getting the materials in enough time to respond, to read them, to engage? So, you know, just thinking about those kind of things can help you have a better meeting all along. So again, we talked about this, but again, I'm going to say again, the board chair runs the board meeting. If the board chair is not available, it's the vice chair. And then if the vice chair is not available, it could be the treasurer or secretary. But again, you need to think about, you know, if your main leadership or officers are not going to be at the board meeting, can you postpone the board meeting or whatever? One of the other things that I always recommend is that giving people all the board meetings and committee meetings as much in advance as you can. So I'm one of those crazy people that still uses a paper calendar. And so I love when I go to my first board meeting and they give me a list of the board meetings and committee meetings, and I write them all on my calendar. Doesn't mean that I make them all, but at least I've made the commitment to put them in my calendar, and I consistently know when they are, so I can plan my schedule as best I can. The other thing that I've talked about before on some of these classes is that when you ask people to be on your board, when you recruit people, let them know we meet the second Tuesday of every month at 5 o'clock. Are you going to be able to do that? Because you don't want somebody to say they're going to join your board, get to the first board meeting and realize that, oh my gosh, 5 o'clock, my wife is a nurse, she can't get home, I have to be home every day at 5 o'clock, so I'll never be able to make a meeting. So you really want to think about that. So again, the board chair starts the meeting. He or she welcomes any members. He checks for conflicts of interest on the items on the agenda. So, you know, like for example, if you're voting on if you're talking about the CEO evaluation, and somebody in the room, you know, somebody on the board has a different kind of relationship, that they might be a conflict, you actually note it in the minutes, and also they have to recuse themselves when you're talking about that. And then the board chair kind of starts the meeting by letting everybody know, you know, what we're going to do at this meeting, and then he or she should not be talking the whole meeting. He should be letting other people appropriately talk. So if it's the executive director's report, let them do their thing. If it's the treasurer's report, let them do their thing, that kind of stuff. So really important that the executive director helps to facilitate an engaged group. Again, I'm going to talk a lot during this section about board engagement, but again, thinking about, you know, again, if everybody's on there, a lot of people are using their iPads or texting during the meeting, why are they not engaged? Are we just talking at them? Are we not giving people enough information to understand what we're talking about? That kind of stuff. And again, try to be active. I mean, you know, when I first moved to Richmond, almost, I guess, 38 years ago, one of the things, I was in a women's group, like a women's club. And so it was everybody at the meetings had a purpose. So for example, the head of the organization might have called you and said, hey, can you bring cookies to the next meeting? Or can you pick up the speaker for the next meeting? Or blah, blah, blah. So make sure everybody has a reason to be in the room and a reason to participate in things. So again, if somebody on your board is, you know, an expert on eviction, then maybe they're the person to talk about if you're talking about eviction in your affordable housing organization. So don't, use people in the, on your board appropriately. Again, lots of board education is really important. I talked about the mission moment, and that's a really important thing. One of the ways, if you think about engaging board members, is that you could actually call a board member in advance and say, hey, I want you to share mission moment next month at the board meeting. You can talk to so-and-so on our staff and they'll help you do that, or here's some ideas. And so don't put them on the spot and say, at the board meeting, say, Amy, I need you to report on the mission moment. Give them time in advance, but it also helps engage them. Also, don't be afraid to talk about tough issues at the board meeting. Again, you don't want to have a kumbaya at every board meeting. You don't want to have a big argument at every board meeting either, but you want to share good and bad information. I mean, if the organization is having problems, the board needs to be aware that they don't want to hear, 2 weeks later that half the staff quit and they didn't know why. So really, really important. And think about, do you need board retreats to share, to train board members on fundraising or governance issues, or talk about, the mission of the organization and how they can tell the story. So, you can't expect somebody who joins your board to know everything about your organization. You have to keep educating them about that. And again, a managed meeting, and I'm going to say this a lot, is a meeting that has a thoughtfully prepared agenda. You may use an executive session, you may use a consent agenda, you may use dashboards. Doesn't mean you have to, but you want to be respectful and about people's time. So one of the things, I don't know if I've said this or not, but I'm going to say now, is typically you don't want to have a board meeting that goes on for hours and hours. You want to, manage your board members' expectations. So when typically on most of the boards that I serve on, they say that a board meeting will last an hour and a half. You don't want to run through the board meeting so quick that you haven't discussed issues that you need to discuss. But one of the things that I appreciate about the boards that I serve on is that if they think the meeting is going to run longer than our normal meeting, they will let us know in advance, and they'll say, hey, I just want to let you guys know we've got a lot on the agenda. We normally have an hour and a half meeting. I hope you'll plan on being there for 2 hours. We may not need it, but please plan your schedule appropriately. That way you're not having people looking at their watch and going, oh my God, I can't believe they're keeping me here. I didn't plan this. I didn't tell my babysitter I had to be home to let my kids go to bed or whatever. The other thing is, I talked a few minutes ago about putting all your dates on a calendar. It is okay to cancel a meeting if you don't need it. You don't want to meet just to meet. You want to be thoughtful about, hey, you know what? We don't really need the October meeting. We can cover most of this through email. We don't have any big things to vote on. We're going to cancel that meeting. So it's okay to do that, because what that means is you're respecting your board members' time and energy, and you're being thoughtful about when you're bringing them together for, you're not just bringing them together for the sake of checking off a box saying we had a meeting. So very important kind of points. And if you do that, your board members will want to come to meetings, because they'll know that the meetings that you're having, we're going to discuss important issues, and it's not just the same, oh, I could read the executive director's report and I could read all the reports. I don't have to come to the meeting. So I'm going to spend a minute talking about executive sessions. So on the bottom, it says open meetings are called the Sunshine Review. I don't know how many of you on the call are organizations that are state or federal, or are subject to what they call the sunshine laws. So sunshine laws, typically I used to serve on a state board, and what sunshine laws means is that you have to have what's called an open meeting. So that means that you have to post somewhere public, whether it's on your website, whether it's on a meeting board or whatever, that you're having a meeting, and that way you'll have a time in your meeting when outside people can come to the meeting and speak. So I used to be on the board of the Virginia College Savings Plan, the 529 plan. And so we had to post our meetings on our website, and we could have, it was called an open meeting, and we could have time on the meeting when participants who owned a 529 plan through our organization could come to the meeting and speak. You typically don't have a lot of people doing that, but you have to do that. That's called an open meeting. You also have, with an open meeting, you also need to, when you go into executive session, you have to read a certain blurb and sign a certain thing, because they are when nobody outside is typically going to be in the meeting. So I'm going to go on to normal organizations that aren't subject to the Sunshine Law. But typically an executive session is a time when the full board can meet in private, and a lot of times it's with or without the executive director. Board Source really feels that if you have an executive session at every board meeting, then that way it becomes part of the routine. And it might be, you know, just a 5-minute executive director shares, gosh, I'm really stressed. This COVID has been making me crazy. We're having to do X, Y, and Z, and I need more support from the board. Or it might be, we need to talk about the executive director's evaluation, you know, executive director goes out of the room. So it's not, the more you do it, it's not the scary kind of thing where the executive director is just standing outside the door with a cup to the door and kind of saying, oh my God, they're going to fire me because we have an executive session. So it's good practice to add that to your meetings. And this is just a little bit more about an executive session. Again, it's a time when full board and can meet in private with or without the chief executive. It's typically very confidential. It's kind of debatable whether you have to take minutes during a executive session. That's up to, I guess, how the organization operates, part of your culture. But again, the 2 bullets, you know, here are really important, that the executive session can be used routinely to strengthen mutual understanding, board cohesion, board chief executive partnership, and it could also be used consistently to alleviate feelings of apprehension and lessen secretive and covert atmosphere. So again, really important. Again, I'm stressing it's different than the executive committee. This is an executive session within the full board. So I'm going to stop for a minute and see if there's any questions about this. And then if not, I'll go on.
We have a question, Amy, from Lisa Coleman. Do you have any suggestions for engaging the board during COVID virtual meetings?
Yep, and I'm going to talk about that at the end. So can we wait? Can you hold your question? If I don't talk about it, we'll do it at the end. Would that be okay?
Yeah,
okay.
And then someone commented that the Sunshine website does not exist anymore. So we'll look that up and send it back.
Yeah,
so
I have a handout on Sunshine laws.
Okay.
So I'll send that to you.
Thank you.
I just made a note.
Okay, that's all we have for right now.
So, okay. So let me talk about consent agenda, and you will be getting a white paper on that. So consent agenda is typically when you take the agenda and you bundle some of the items on the agenda. So you might bundle the minutes. You might bundle committee reports if you formally type up committee reports. You don't want to bundle anything under that needs discussion, like the treasurer's report. You probably don't want to put that on the consent agenda. Executive director's report, that's debatable whether you want to do that or not. You typically want to give the executive director, chief executive, time to speak at the board meeting. But anyway, typically what happens is consent agenda means that these items that are bundled are going to be either voted on or approved as a bundle. You can remove anything from that bundle if you want to take it out. So for example, when you start the meeting, the board chair will say, you know, you have the list of items that are on the consent agenda. Is everybody okay with moving forward and agreeing to the items on the consent agenda? And then we'll move on to the rest of the meeting. The purpose of the consent agenda really is so that you leave more time for discussion and active discussion and active learning at the board meeting. You're not tied up you're not tied up on reading reports through that consent agenda. You also want to make sure that you know that you're ready for a consent agenda when you can confidently say that your board members are reading what you're sending them in advance. If you do not think that your board members are reading what you're sending them in advance, you know, we need to work on that, get the board members to read stuff in advance, because, you know, they need to be prepared for the board meeting. And again, you can remove any items on the consent agenda that you need to discuss, and you can vote to amend the agenda and move on to critical issues. And you'll get more information in that white paper, but I think, you know, this just kind of gives you just a high level. So I did give you a sample agenda. Does not mean you have to use this, but again, you can see they've got welcome and chair remarks. Then they have what the consent agenda, and this is typically, again, some of these things are not in the consent agenda. They can be, which, you know, the treasurer's report, the committee reports, approval of the agenda, and then there might be the next thing is this, you know, what are we talking about? Are we merging? Whatever, and then new business, and then adjournment. And there can be other things on there, like some people actually on the committee reports, some people, if you have a lot of committees, they may say, you know, we're doing a report from each committee written, but we're going to have once a month, every meeting, we're going to have one committee report out more so that people are learning about committees and what the committees are doing. So again, remember that you want to have an expected agenda, but it can be amended and changed as needed. You know, like, again, I'll remind you that board members should think about if they want to add something to the agenda, they either need to call the board chair or they can let the executive director know something needs to be added to the agenda. That's perfectly appropriate. There's I don't know how many of you are using dashboards, but it's kind of a new thing now that people are pushing. It's typically, the way I describe it is a kind of Excel spreadsheet, and then you make it graphs, or it's pretty graphs. And it's typically a way of kind of sharing your progress and tracking progress, but also thinking about a quick way for somebody to look at it. So some people do a dashboard with, like, they highlight things in yellow, green, yellow, and red. So green would be things that are humming along, yellow might be things to watch, and red might be things that we need to talk about. Some people use it for, you know, board attendance. They might use it for board pledges to the, you know, fundraising campaign. They might use it for, you know, volunteer time. They might use it to track progress on a certain program. So many different ways to do it. And I'm definitely not the expert in it, but there is some value, as you can see in the red, to using it. And it also reinforces board oversight, because the board can kind of look at it and say, oh, we need to think about these things in red, or we need to kind of realize that these are the things we're doing well. The yellow is things that we might need a little bit work on, and the red is things we definitely need to work on. And again, there's some things on the right: mission, strategic initiatives, risk factors, services, and resources. Remember, I'll put in a plug for strategic planning. Remember that you don't want to do your strategic plan and then put it on the shelf. You want to have an active implementation plan to your strategic plan. And because when you do your strategic plan, it's appropriate to kind of set time limits. And typically the work of the strategic plan is done by the staff and committees. So here's a great way to track, hey, you know, these were the governance initiatives that we needed to do through the strategic plan. We need to look at our bylaws. We need to update our board expectation sheet. We needed to update our committee descriptions. So you could use a dashboard to say, these are the things in green we've done. These are the things we're working on in yellow. And these are the things in red that we're having issues with. So lots of ways to use it. And again, it's one of those topics that's really getting more explored out there. Any questions on dashboards or anything?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We don't have any new questions right now.
Okay.
Do you have any examples? I mean, this has been great information on how to build a dashboard. Do you have any examples of dashboards you could share with us?
I'll put it on my list. I'm not sure. I know that BoardSource came out with a book on dashboards.
Oh,
but I'm not sure. I don't know if I have a copy of it, but I'll check.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wait, it looks like we got a question. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
We have a question from Jamie Rhodes. Is it in Excel? Who manages the dashboard, the executive director or the board chair?
Definitely the staff manages the dashboard. The governance committee, which we hadn't really talked about, I thought I had a slide in here, but I'm going to spend a minute talking about the governance committee. But typically the governance committee would monitor some of the board activities. But typically the staff would put it together. I mean, a committee chair could work with the staff or the executive director to put things on the dashboard, but it should be more outcome based and more strategic based on the strategic plan. So it would be more the CEO, executive director's job to manage it, in coordination with board members who serve on committees. So let me just spend a minute, because I thought I had a slide on it, but a lot of this stuff is going back to board engagement kind of is the job of the governance committee. So the governance committee is the committee that really talks about board development. So typically the governance committee is the committee that helps recruit and nominate and orientate people. They work with the staff to do this, obviously. The governance committee also helps provide board education. They kind of monitor, I had a sample. They kind of monitor board participation, that kind of stuff. A lot of organizations who are really small may not have a governance committee, but they might have somebody on the executive committee who keeps track of some of the governance stuff. And I'm going to make a note to send, in case, I thought I put it in here, but I'll send you something on the governance committee, Stephanie, and you can send that out to people, because it's a really important committee, and especially when you think about these things that we're talking about today. And so I think I did put a sample dashboard. It didn't come through. I have no idea why it didn't come through. I'll see what this slide was supposed to be, and I'll definitely send you that and any information I have on dashboard. Sorry about that. I have no idea what the slide happened. Okay, so I want to talk for a minute about communication during and between meetings, because it's not only important to send out materials in advance to give people enough time to review them, but you also want to make sure that in between meetings you're communicating. So one of the boards that I used to serve on was the United Way, and when I served on the board, I served on the board for 9 years. We had an executive, a weekly email from the executive director. Every week. I'm not suggesting that, but you should have a kind of system where the executive director can send out something between meetings. You don't want to send out too many things, so maybe you send it out if your board meets every other month. Maybe you send it out in the month that the board doesn't meet. But again, you want to make sure people are up to date, and board members, it's your job to read those things that are going out. And board chair, that's one of the things that you need to stress at board meetings, is that please, I've had stories of executive directors say they send out something to the board and they say, please respond by X date, and nobody even responds that they got the communication. So that's really frustrating. But again, this slide talks about communication during and between meetings. So again, making sure board members are prepared for meetings. So don't send them stuff the day before the meeting. Try and give them a little bit of time to read it. Again, make sure the meeting's well run. They're focused on strategy and policy. You should not get the board together to talk about how to plan a party or how to plan the fundraiser. At the board meeting, when you're talking about the fundraiser, the board should weigh in on, hey, like you could come to the board and say, hey, we're having a fundraiser in a month and attendance is really low. And so what do you think us as board members can do to get the attendance up? And again, make sure that the board meetings are time for board members to explore issues and ask questions. In between meetings, you want to make sure that we all volunteer for stuff at board meetings. So you want to make sure that somebody follows up. So for example, let's say you have a board meeting, an in-person board meeting, I'm going to say, I'll go back to the virtual in a minute, and somebody says, I'm willing to help plan a cultivation breakfast for someone, for the organization. And then the month goes by, you don't hear from me. After that board meeting, when I volunteered to do it, somebody on the staff, whether it's executive director or the program person or the fundraising person, should have called me and said, hey, Amy, thank you so much for volunteering to help with the cultivation breakfast. Let's either get a date together or talk now about what you can do to help us and what we as staff can do. And then the staff might say, well, we're gonna book the date once we determine it. We're gonna book the place, blah, blah, blah. We need you to come in and handwrite invitations. We need you to help with the guest list, that kind of stuff. So be very clear. It's okay if somebody volunteers for something, for somebody to follow up, because that's called holding the board members accountable. Also, if again, you're having a meeting on something and you know that somebody has expertise on that or has access to experts on that topic, please call them and say, hey, Amy, can you call so-and-so or help us think about a person to come and talk at our next board meeting? Also, making sure that committees have clear directions. So again, making sure that, you know, the finance committee knows that the audit is coming up, or the fundraising committee knows that they're responsible to do blah, blah, blah. Also encourage staff involvement, not just the executive director. So that's a great time to, you know, if you have a fundraiser, maybe have the staff do some, you know, calling to the board and let them kind of use their fundraising expertise to work with the board. So really important, you don't want to go silent in between meetings. You want to think about communicating, not over communicating, because there's a fine line of that, but communicating on appropriate items to board members. So the other thing that I want to talk about is it's really important to evaluate the board. You don't necessarily need I mean, BoardSource has a great formal evaluation that they charge a lot of money for. Love for you to use that, but it's not critical. You can do something as simple as, you know, looking at how many times over the last year you didn't make quorum for a board meeting, or how many times you had to wait an hour or 30 minutes to get being able to vote for something because you didn't have enough people in the room, or how many times, you know, somebody start noticing that, you know, a third of the board is not showing up on a regular basis, or a third of the board is on their cell phones or texting or whatever. So there's lots of ways to evaluate the board. I mean, I've done formal governance surveys with organizations to know, you know, whether the board understands the mission, board members understand their role. But again, there's lots of different ways out there to do that. But it's really important to know, you know, that your board members are engaged, and if they're not, what can you do to get them engaged? And again, this is just a statistic I thought was interesting, that CEOs of boards have done a formal written board assessment in the past 3 years, report that higher performing boards, better board orientation, and greater board engagement. So when you've had a formal written board assessment, there's higher performing boards, better board orientation, and greater board engagement. So interesting. So again, I'm not going to belabor this, but again, you want to make that you're assessing the board because you're keeping them accountable. You're giving opportunity to strengthen the board. Maybe you need to do more education, more training. Maybe you don't have a board expectation sheet. You need to get one. And just make sure that, you know, serving on a board is a volunteer job, and people understand the importance of their being on the board. You don't want to recruit somebody and just say, oh, you know, we just need your name on the letterhead. Hopefully you're not doing that, and hopefully it's not true that you have a reason for putting different people on your board because they bring different skills and expertise to the board. You don't just want to have a bunch of rich, don't take this the wrong way, because everybody needs people with time, talent, and treasure. You don't want to have people on your board who only bring treasure and they have no time to do any work, because that's not going to help also. I don't know why these slides are not coming out. I'll have to send you, Stephanie, these slides again, because for some reason they didn't come out. So I want to also talk about, excuse me, assessing the CEO. And we talked about, typically it's the full board's job to assess the CEO. The board chair typically initiates that. And again, it's an opportunity for the board to express support. It's also an opportunity to, you know, give feedback, positive or negative. If you don't assess the board chair, CEO, he or she doesn't know what they're doing right or wrong, and they're just going to keep doing it. The other thing about CEO assessment I'm going to add is that it's really important to give the CEO an opportunity to assess his or herself. You want to make sure that when you do a CEO assessment, that, you know, you have the executive director, chief executive, whatever you're calling them, set some goals that they hold themselves accountable for. You don't want to, as the board or the board chair, hand the executive director a list of goals and say, these are things that we want you to do, kind of work in partnership to things that they think are important in their performance and that the board thinks is important, and kind of coming to a meeting of the minds. So it's a very, it should be a positive experience, because remember, the board's job is to assess, to hire, assess, and support the board chair, the executive director. You don't just want to have an executive director and you never tell him or her what's wrong, and then a year it gets time for him or her to renew their contract, and you're like, no, we're not renewing your contract. So really important, honest communication and feedback. So I did put in here, so this is the role of the governance committee. Again, it's to lead board recruitment, orientation, education, encourage ongoing board development. So when I say board development, that means making sure that there's a board succession plan, that, you know, we know who's going to be the next vice chair, who's going to be the next president of the organization, you know, who's going to be in charge of the fundraising committee, who's going to be in charge of the governance committee, who's rolling off the board, and what skills, you know, is going off the board. Like maybe, you know, you have 2 lawyers on your board and they're both having their terms up. Do you need somebody on the board with legal experience? Also, the role of the board governance committee is to set board roles and responsibilities and expectations, to actually evaluate the board, and this succession planning and nominations. So really important job of the governance committee. Again, if you don't have a governance committee, it's perfectly appropriate to use your executive committee to do this, but you should make sure somebody on the executive committee is specifically thinking about these items for governance. So again, I can't stress enough this, you know, board engagement. And now we're going to talk just a little bit about virtual engagement. So again, first thing is you need to look at your bylaws and make sure that your bylaws don't need to be updated for virtual meetings. There's some, like I know that one of the boards I used to serve on had a clause in the bylaws that we couldn't have people call into the board meetings. So during COVID, of course, that's a problem. So they had to suspend some policies and amend some others. You also want to make sure that the board and the CEO, executive director, are working really closely together. You don't want the board to not be aware of any sustainability problems you're having, any issues out there. You want to make sure that you're working closely with the board members. Y'all are working together to kind of think about things that affect the organization and how everybody can brainstorm about bringing, you know, ideas and things to solve these problems. You want to also try and maintain meetings and committee meetings as best you can virtually. It's not a time to suspend all your work. It's a time to kind of think about how to operate differently, and also making sure, again, there's good documentation on board and committee actions. The other thing I realized that I didn't have a slide on here for a second to just harken back is you do need to take board minutes at each meeting, whether that's the secretary takes them, whether you tape them and somebody takes them after, whether there's a staff person that takes it, but you do need to take minutes. And I think the IRS requires that you keep them on file. You don't have to send them into the IRS, obviously, when you send in your 990. You also need to make sure that you're also doing the conflict of interest form once a year and keeping that on file. Even if somebody serves 9 years on your board, they still have to fill out a conflict of interest form every year. So before I keep going, are there any questions about virtual meetings? Because I mean, I know somebody had asked a question. If you want to remind me, I can try and, you know, add some things about virtual meetings.
Yeah, so I think the question was how to keep them engaged throughout that virtual meeting, but I don't see any new questions.
Okay, so the engagement comes with, you know, whether you're doing it in person or virtual, you still need to send the materials in advance. Make sure you're using screen share. Make sure the person that is running the meeting, you know, if they're running the Zoom also, that they know how to work the equipment, because nothing's more frustrating to participants if you don't have, you know, the equipment working. Also making sure there are ways to put people in chat rooms and do smaller group learning. So that might be something that needs to be done. You know, there's so many ways to engage people, and it's the same as engaging them in a, you know, face-to-face meeting. It's just making sure people want to sign on. Again, if you're going to just do reports at that meeting and not have any time for anybody to engage with each other, why do they need to sign on? So thinking about it that way. I also have some other stuff too. You might want to think about engaging in what they call scenario planning. And during this time with your board, so again, there's kind of 2 different sides of scenario planning. There's the fiduciary and strategic planning, and then there's also the generative and strategic thinking. And they're actually 2 different things, and this is a good way to engage your board. So again, making sure that if you're doing like fiduciary, which means your financial, the board members are weighing in on alternatives and choosing. Like, so for example, let's say you have to make a 20% pay cut. The board needs to weigh in on that. Is everybody going to take the pay cut? Are you going to, you know, get rid of your part-time people for a little bit of time and just do your full-time, or how is that going to affect, and making sure you're understanding how it's going to affect how you do your operations. Also, making sure that you're making decisions and solving problems, and that the board is kind of weighing in and asking pragmatic questions. Remember, again, I keep saying this, but everybody on the board brings a different kind of skill to the board. So again, making sure that people, I'm looking at, and that people make sure that people understand what they bring to the board and how to best use that. On the generative side, you want to also make sure you're not hiding difficulties, that you're engaging board members early in these decision-making processes, that you're not making decisions harshly, so, or quickly. So you're saying, we have 3 months left in our operating reserves. We need to think about how to, keep our reserves getting bigger. What do we do? Blah, blah, blah. And then thinking about how you're going to decide and what you're going to do. And the board's going to propose catalytic questions that might, make some changes. But again, it's really important to involve your board in these decisions, and don't just, go to the executive committee, or don't just go the executive director and the board chair make these decisions and then go back to the board. It's important for let board members weigh in, because you never know what they're going to bring to the table. So I'm kind of early. I can talk and ask more questions, but I want to end my formal remarks, or my formal PowerPoint, with things about board engagement. And these are my top 10 things, and I've said them in the PowerPoint, but I think they're important. Again, you want to hold board members accountable. So if a board member misses a meeting or 2 meetings, somebody needs to call them, preferably the board chair, and say, hey, Amy, we missed you. Let's get together and talk about what's been going on. And it gives me an opportunity to kind of say, oh my gosh, my life is hectic. I don't know if I'm going to be able to stay on this board, blah, blah, blah. Also, you want to be really intentional and strategic when you get people on your board. So again, you want to make sure you tell them what's expected of them. We expect you to make a financial contribution. We expect you to come to, 8 of the 10 board meetings at a minimum. Here's when we meet. We have committees. We expect you to serve on committee. And that's all usually documented through a board expectation sheet. The board expectation sheet is not a legal document, but it's like an agreement, so that board members have in front of them what they expect when they go on a board. You also want to think about this accountability. I've had some organizations use what they call a board report card. Actually, they take the board expectation sheet and give it back to the board member privately, or they give the board member 6 months or a year. Hey, here's the number of board meetings you've attended. Here's what you've made your pledge for. You haven't been to any committee meetings, so that as an individual board member, it's not shared with everybody. It's a document for just my eyes. I see, oh my gosh, I've been a horrible board member. Let me think about stepping it up for my next term, my next year, or no, I know it's not going to change. So let me possibly give up my slot on the board. Doesn't mean I'm not interested in the work of the organization, but I'm not being a good board member. You need somebody else who might be a better board member. And then we talked about the whole board evaluation. I'm a big proponent, again, about giving out meeting dates in advance, preferably at the beginning of the calendar year. Doesn't mean you have to stick to it. Doesn't mean you can't revise them. But again, being very clear back to what's expected when you have your meetings, and thinking about, our meetings usually last an hour and a half. We're going to try and stick to that. But, if we need to go over, we think we have a lot of issues, we're going to let people know in advance, and we're going to be willing to cancel meetings as we need to. The other is, again, be respectful of board members' time. So remember, no board members should be getting paid for being on your board. And so be respectful of their time. They all have families and jobs and other commitments. So being on your board, you want it to be a good experience to be on your board. Again, it's call board members when they miss meetings. When a meeting, call committee members. So when you get your committee chairs, they should understand that they might need to call a committee member and say, hey, Amy, I haven't seen you at 2 committee meetings. Is everything okay? Are you aware we meet here? Here's what we're doing. Also, making sure that you're engaging board members at board meetings. So maybe you ask them to give the mission moment, or you ask them to welcome the speaker, or you ask them to identify a speaker. And then you also want to make sure that, again, with this evaluation of full board meetings, why aren't you getting a quorum? Is this happening a lot of times? You need to change meeting times. You need to change meeting format, meeting place, that kind of stuff. So I'll put them back up one more time because I went pretty quickly, but this is the first 5.
Amy, I have some questions that are posted. You want?
Yep.
Okay.
Got plenty of time. Yep.
Should the bylaws specifically note that virtual meeting is permissible?
Yes. Yes, you need to look at your bylaws and see if there's anything in there that's prohibitive for you operating the way you're operating now, and check on that, put that in. And I will say that even when I work on bylaws with an organization, I require that they have a lawyer look at it at the end. You don't want to make sure that you have a lawyer or somebody with legal experience look at your bylaws when you make changes to it to make sure you're not making any changes that are contrary to something legal or whatever, or contradict each other.
And our next question is, what is the conflict of interest form? Does it relate to those relationships that may interfere with hiring of executive director, as we discussed earlier?
Yes, so conflict of interest. So one of the responsibilities of individual board members that we've talked about is as an individual board member, you're responsible for filling out what they call a conflict of interest form every year. And an organization should have a formal conflict of interest policy that typically they give to your board members. And typically the policy talks about relationships that you might have with staff. It might talk about, like relationships you have, like let's say you work for Capital One. You might have to disclose, if the board votes on something that affects stock or Capital One or whatever, you might need to disclose it. I can't name all the things in the conflict of interest, but it's things like when I was on the board of the United Way, that I give out money through the Mary Morton Parsons Foundation. So if there was an organization that the board was voting on that got money from the United Way, and Mary Morton Parsons gave money to them, I may, depending on the timing of the money or anything, I might have to remove myself from the voting on that issue. So it's different reasons, but it is important that each organization has a formal conflict of interest policy and that your board members sign it every year and you keep it on file. The other responsibility of the board as a whole is to review the 990, the tax form, before it gets sent in. And the 990 also kind of mentions that there is a conflict of interest form, a policy that exists.
I have a specific example. We have developed a virtual academy for education. One of our founding board members is now going to teach. Can she still be on our board?
As long as she's not getting paid, yes. But if she's getting paid, then technically she shouldn't be on your board. So, just like if when I sit on a board, if they're putting out an RFP for a strategic plan and I get the gig for the strategic plan, then I should remove myself from the board unless I'm willing to do it pro bono, and that's a whole nother discussion. But if you're going to get compensation, you shouldn't be on a board. You shouldn't be on a board if you're going to get compensation from that organization.
I think that is all the questions.
Okay, is there anything that you want me to go back over, Stephanie, that I went through quickly? Because we still have some time. So.
No, this has been amazing. I mean, you've given us so much information, Amy. I'm going to follow up and send all the handouts to everyone because there's so much more information in it that it's kind of something you want to process, but.
I also have a list here, Stephanie, I don't mean to interrupt you. I'm going to send you information on the working board, the sunshine laws, dashboards, possibly something on governance committee and the conflict of interest. And then I'm also going to go back and those slides that for some reason didn't come through. I'm going to see if I can figure out why that did happen and if I can add stuff to it. I might not. So before you send the PowerPoint to everybody, you might want to remove those slides. I don't think they're critical to the presentation. The ones that didn't come out.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think you should remove those because I don't think they're critical, but if anything is critical, I'll send it to you separate.
I appreciate that. And we have recorded this and it'll be available on our YouTube channel. I'll send that out in the follow-up email, but the PowerPoint will tidy it up and send it out with all the handouts. I did want to thank everyone for joining I'm sorry?
I was looking.
Oh, yes. Wait, hold on. Here we go. Yeah, it's just.
Would love to hear your perspective on the dynamics transition of boards who have just hired staff the first time. So I guess, trying to think what I can say. I guess if you're moving transition from like an all volunteer board to a staff board, I think it's important to make sure that the board understands what the executive director or the new staff person's role is going to be and what their role is going to be. I actually have a live example I'll share that I think will be pretty clear. So I was working with an organization and they had the executive director resigned. And so for a period of time, the board was kind of running itself. I mean, they had the board chair, but he was making sure that as the committees meet, he was going to each committee meeting, and board was making a lot of decisions because it was about a 4-month time before they were able to hire a new executive. And so I happened to be working with the board at the time. And so we had a board meeting, two kind of board retreats or a board meeting / retreat where we talked about what qualities they wanted in the new ED and what they saw as the role of the new ED. And then once they had that in place, we also talked about how their role would change as board members. You know, like for example, the ED might schedule the committee meetings and would attend the meetings and help with the agenda, and the board members would kind of, so that the ED was there to kind of coordinate the work of all the committees working together versus one committee meeting one day and the other committee meeting over here, and they didn't realize what each other were doing. So I think it's important when you hire your staff person that they understand their role, they understand that how the board works, and that the board gives time for that partnership to evolve, and you're not, kind of micromanaging the new staff's role. You're giving him or her time to get their feet wet and, work with the board. Maybe you have one person on the board who's whether that's the board chair or someone, to liaison with the new staff person to make sure that they understand the dynamics of the board and how they're working together, and kind of giving them time to catch up and laying out as much in writing and, sharing past history with that person so they can kind of get on board, just giving them time to do that.
Absolutely.
And Stephanie, the other thing I would recommend that you might want to send to this person, I think I sent last time to you, is that all volunteer board handout.
Yes.
And that's a good handout that talks a little bit about this.
Okay, I'll send that too. Got it on here. I wanted to just also share that Amy is going to be doing another board boot camp for us in December. I believe it's December 10th, but I'll put that also in the email if you want to sign up for that. That one is more for general board roles and responsibilities. It's absolutely an excellent training. I would, invite your board members or anyone that would like to join a board to attend. It's an excellent experience. Okay.
So, and I think my name and information is, I can't get this one screen to go away, but I think I'm at the end of here it is. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to get the chat room closed. Told y'all I'm not very good at this. Anyway, I think my information, my contact information is in the last slide in the PowerPoint. And so feel free to contact me directly if you have questions, and I'll get you, I promise, Stephanie, I'll be very good about getting you the handouts quicker than I did last time. The new handouts that I just talked about, the the working board, sunshine laws, that kind of stuff.
You were right on time.
So.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for attending, and I hope everyone has a great week. And thank you, Amy, again. It's always a pleasure to attend your trainings.
Thank you for the opportunity, and everybody stay safe and continue